Welcome, everyone, to today's Endowment for Middle East Truth webinar discussing the fragile Israeli-Jordanian peace, featuring Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, one of Washington, D.C.'s most influential and important foreign policy think tanks, and the source of many of the experts we host on our EMIT webinars. We have quite a lot to cover today, so I'm going to make this introduction very brief and forgo a longer description of Jonathan's impressive resume and accomplishments, as his bio was also included in the invitation to this event. As always, I thank you all for joining and for supporting us. We couldn't do our very important work if it were not for your generous support. Please consider visiting EMIT's website at www.emitonline.org to make a financial contribution. Today's webinar will be recorded and the link for viewing will be sent around tomorrow. If you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to type them in. I'll do my best to get to as many of them as possible later in the program. Thanks so much for joining us today, Jonathan. It's always great to have you with us, sharing your insights and in-depth knowledge on these important issues. Before we get into the issues that have arisen in recent years between Israel and Jordan and their potential impact on the region, I thought it would be helpful to have you begin with a brief discussion of the history of the relationship between Jordan and Israel, perhaps beginning with the '67 war and including the 1994 peace agreement, as well as some background on the domestic issues within Jordan, including its demographics that drive foreign policy, as well as King Abdullah's reign and the precarious nature of the Hashemite regime in power.
Sure. Thanks, Laurie, and thanks to Emmett for having me today. As always, great to be with you. Yeah, I mean, look, the Israeli-Jordanian relationship has not always been an easy one. In fact, I don't think it's ever been easy. The Jordan at the beginning of the creation of the state of Israel, if not before it, was steadfastly opposed to Israel's creation. It joined the 1948 war, where 7 Arab armies ganged up on Israel. Jordan was part of the anti-Israel movement that evolved after the creation of the state of Israel. The Arab League's rejectionism of Israel, Jordan was very much a part of it. In the early 1960s, we began to see something of a, I don't know if you could call it a thaw, but I think Jordan's leadership began to realize that Israel was as much of an asset as it was perhaps an enemy. And so a direct diplomatic connection was made. Israel warned Jordan not to join the 1967 war, and Jordan made a fateful error once the war had already begun, believing wrongly that the Arabs had gotten the better of Israel or that were about to. But even after that, and even after Israel took the West Bank from Jordan and took control of Jerusalem from Jordan, there was this uneasy understanding that Israel was not necessarily Jordan's enemy. In fact, the king continued his relationship quietly with the Israelis. The ongoing diplomatic ties under the table continued. In the lead up to the 1973 Yom Kippur War, in fact, King Hussein warned Israel of an impending attack. This was something that, of course, the Israelis ignored. By 1987, just before the outbreak of the first Intifada, there was almost an agreement struck between Shimon Peres and King Hussein for some kind of diplomatic arrangement or even peace between Jordan and Israel. That, of course, fell apart with the outbreak of the Intifada in 1987. But by the early 1990s, when the Palestinians began their diplomatic dance with Israel, beginning the Oslo process, it became almost impossible for Jordan to be, as we say, holier than the Pope. There was no reason to be more pro-Palestinian than the Palestinians. So if they were engaging in peace with Israel, well, then Jordan could. And so Jordan made its peace with Israel in 1994. And really, since then, it has been identified as the warm peace in the region, right? Certainly compared to the other peace in the region, the one with Egypt, that was a frigid peace, a cold peace, and one that I think most people did not describe as terribly fruitful. It held over the years, both peace agreements held, but the one with Jordan appeared to yield more fruit. And I think that was the case until probably about 4 or 5 years ago, at which point we began to see ties deteriorate in ways that we haven't seen before. And it's deeply unfortunate, and this is what I get into in my recent research memo, that this deterioration of ties comes as the Abraham Accords comes into effect. So you see the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco engaging in a much warmer peace with Israel. You see the Egyptians, in fact, turning a corner and engaging in a more warm peace with Israel, while the Jordanian peace unravels. Now, the question is why? And Lori, you mentioned briefly the sort of demographic and domestic considerations. I do believe that that is the key driver of all of this, is that Jordan is at least 50% Palestinian. It could be as high as 80 or 85%, maybe even more than that. It's a very large percentage of the population. The Jordanian government will not engage directly on this. You know, behind closed doors, informally, they may acknowledge that it's something like 50%. It's likely much more than that. And as a result, if the goal is to keep quiet, if the goal is to keep calm within the kingdom, then engaging in warm ties with Israel is probably not the way to the hearts and minds of the Jordanian population, those that live there. And so what we've seen, certainly since the rise of King Abdullah, after the death of King Hussein, Abdullah, the relatively young king, has, I think, engaged in populist messaging to the Palestinian and Jordanian populations. His excoriation of Israel, I think, resonates with them. And so even while the peace agreement between Jordan and Israel has been very beneficial to Jordan over the long run, water, gas, intelligence, military cooperation, a whole range of things that Jordan can't live without, we continue to see this hardening of rhetoric brought about by the king, but also the prime minister, the foreign minister, the royal court. It came a point for me anyway that over the last couple of years where I said, you know what, something's wrong. Things continue to go in the exact wrong direction, and that's why I ended up writing this report. I went to Jordan. I interviewed a number of officials and stakeholders in Jordan. Came back a bit more dismayed than I was even before I came, and so that's the background for today's discussion.
Thanks, Jonathan. You've actually covered so much in that, and we'll get into some of those issues a little more in a couple minutes. But before we move on, and with all of that in mind, I think it's important to understand Jordan's strategic significance to both Israel's and the United States' national security interests and the role it plays in furthering those interests. So why should the U.S. care about Jordan, and how important is Jordan in maintaining security in the region?
Yeah, you know, it's a really important question, and one that I think I'd really like to underscore here. When this report came out, I did get a number of communications from people saying, "Oh, well, I'm pro-Jordan or I'm anti-Jordan, and good for you for criticizing them, or how dare you criticize them." The point here is that Jordan is an ally of the United States. It is an ally of Israel. It has strategic importance, but we need to be able to criticize the way in which these relationships are built. For the United States, Jordan has not always been this sort of strategic bedrock for the region, but over the years, certainly since the 1994 peace agreement between Israel and Jordan, the United States has invested more and more. It serves as sort of a buffer between Israel and the Mediterranean from, let's just say, the rest of the Arab world, where things have been very unstable in recent decades. And so Jordan serves as this important bulwark. It's a buffer from radical Islam, from virulent strains of Arab nationalism. All of these things, I think, are really important, that Jordan maintains that space. And I think the idea here is, when we like to talk about the Shiite crescent, right? We talk a lot about Iran's reach throughout the region, where you can see how they have this contiguous space running from Iran to Iraq to Syria to Lebanon to the Mediterranean. Well, one could also make the argument here that you've got Saudi Arabia into Jordan, into Israel, and that could be the sort of moderate pro-American crescent, if you will. And so it's been an important cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy in the region. A fight, someone who's or a country that's fought against radical Islam, fought against ISIS, fought against al-Qaeda, and worked with Israel. And from Israel's perspective, all of this is crucial as well. It's for this reason that Israel even intervened in the Black September crisis of 1971. Even before the peace agreement had even been reached, there was this understanding from Israel's perspective that this was a pragmatic country that needed to be preserved, and that it did not want the Assad regime and the Palestinians to topple it. Today, the Israelis provide a huge amount of intelligence, military training, water, gas, just a whole range of important services and commodities to the Jordanians to try to ensure its long-term stability. And so it's in this light that we have to say to ourselves, look, it's great. We want these relationships to continue. But the Jordanians really, I think, need to think very carefully about the way in which they criticize Israel, they attack Israel, that they side with Hamas, or they embrace rhetoric that is similar to Iran during moments of tension in the region. And I think it's hard to understand why Jordan would go down this road in light of the important support that it gets from the United States and from Israel.
So you're answering some of the questions that I'll have, and I will want to drill down more. But let me just ask you a question about the change in the relationship that you document in your report. And by the way, we're going to put the link up to Jonathan's very important report. It's called Neither Here Nor There, Jordan and the Abraham Accords. And Hussein, I sent you the link. If you could put it in the chat, that would be great, please. But John, why now? I mean, it was clear for the 8 years of a pro-Palestinian Obama administration, which did some things that were very detrimental, I think, to Israel for those 8 years. And then transitioning into the pro-Israel Trump administration, that there wasn't going to be an Israeli-Palestinian two-state solution that's imminent. So why now? I mean, you would think that King Abdullah would be fully aware that a two-state solution is not happening tomorrow.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what's so interesting is that, for a leader that refuses to cede the notion that Jordan is Palestine, right? We hear that all the time, and we can fully understand why the Jordanians would reject that. They want their own sovereign state. They'd like to see a Palestinian state in its place. They have emerged as the foremost proponent of the Palestinians. I mean, in some ways more Palestinian than the Palestinians are. And they have really dug in on this. So during the Obama administration era, I guess we could say that there was at least attempts to build some consensus surrounding the two-state solution. That, of course, did not materialize. And the Obama administration found itself pivoting more toward Iran, having to put out the fires of the Arab Spring, which, by the way, also did touch on Jordan. It had its own fair share of protests, and the Obama administration, working with the Israelis and others, helped to tamp down those tensions and to keep stability there. So that moment passed. Then you have the Trump administration come in, where there was clearly an attempt to accentuate Israel's shared interests with other Arab states, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, perhaps Saudi Arabia. And yes, it certainly did not portend a two-state solution being on the horizon. But it didn't rule it out either. I understand why Jordan didn't like some of the policies that Trump had, but it wasn't as if the flame had been entirely extinguished. And now we see ourselves in a moment where the Biden administration is trying to breathe some life back into Palestinian nationalism, right? A lot of its policies are determined right now to kind of revive the movement as we once knew it, and to perhaps even get back to a two-state discussion at some point. I don't know how likely that is. I would say probably not so likely right now. But yet here we have right now a country, Jordan, that is just so incredibly hard line on this, refusing to recognize the sort of waning realities here of that two-state solution. So it's hard to understand why they're pushing so hard for this, and why that rhetoric is getting worse. Perhaps it's just, one thing that I did pick up while I was there was just that maybe it's just a sense of panic that even with the right leadership in their mind, with the Biden administration in power right now, and really, determined to do something to help the Palestinian movement, it's still not gaining speed. In my mind, I'll just say this: I think their real frustration should be with Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, who has essentially just sucked the life out of the entire movement. I mean, this is a guy that is now in his 80s. He refuses to step down. He's been in since 2005. There is no life to the Palestinian nationalist movement as we know it. So if the Jordanians are truly interested in reviving Palestinian nationalism, what they should be doing is pushing him out and trying to push for a revived system, some new leadership. It's not Israel's fault here that there is no partner on the other side. This is not to say that Israel's perfect, but Jordan's frustrations, I think, are greatly misplaced.
So let me just take that a step further. Given the importance of a Palestinian state to the Jordanian Palestinian population, why do you think that King Abdullah hasn't taken a more active role in promoting the two-state solution and pushing back against Palestinian recalcitrants, whether it's, Abbas or, whomever? Wouldn't it make sense for Jordan to put pressure on Palestinian leadership? Or is that simply not possible given to the current state of the Hamas-PA relations, and certainly now that tensions are flaring up in the West Bank?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's complicated. And again, that gets back to the domestic situation that we discussed, right? If more than 50% or even 3/4 of your population is Palestinian, and it's popular to say that Israel is to blame, then the idea that you turn on the Palestinian leadership itself and point the finger at them, that may not resonate with his own people. So I think it's a bit of a balancing act for Abdullah and for the royal court, right? On the one hand, they are trying to push for a two-state solution again, or to revive it in some shape or form. On the other hand, it really probably can't get done without having the Palestinians take those steps, and then they've got their domestic considerations. So it's a tightrope walk for them. It's not an easy thing. But again, I get the sense that rhetoric is just hardening in a way that is going to be hard for Abdullah to step back from. And the other thing that I should just note here is that as the Israelis continue to provide this security, the intelligence, the water, the gas, and all the other things, they've opened up the West Bank economy for Jordanian products. There is really an attempt to try to help Jordan remain stable and remain solvent. The Israeli leadership is growing frustrated. And I've heard this from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I've heard it from the Prime Minister's office and elsewhere. Of course, this is before Bibi came in, right? This is over the last year and a half, talking to the Bennett-Lapid folks. Between Bibi and Abdullah, the relationship is way worse. They have bad blood. There was a time when Bibi and Abdullah could not even meet. Bibi used to send Yossi Cohen, the head of the Mossad, to meet with Abdullah because Abdullah would not meet with Bibi himself. So we may be actually heading into even choppier waters right now. And with that rhetoric being as tough as it is, I'm not sure that it's going to be easy for Abdullah to walk back. And of course, you should just note here that Ben-Gvir's walk on the Temple Mount yesterday, right, was noted with disdain by the Jordanians. And the Jordanians even warned Bibi before the government was formed about changing the status quo on the Temple Mount and a whole bunch of other things. So I expect some choppier waters ahead.
Yeah, so we're going to get into the new government in a couple minutes, but I want to go back for a second because you talked about some conflicts that King Abdullah has to balance, some balancing acts. And one of them, Abdullah doesn't have the same issues that the other parties to the Abraham Accords have in terms of the internal demographic issues, the Palestinian population. But is King Abdullah struggling with the balance between Jordan's regional security and recognizing the threats that Iran poses to it versus this internal dissension and concerns over political stability? I mean, Cliff May, your colleague at FDD, wrote that the King of Jordan is a moderate, modern, and savvy sovereign, but without Israel's support, his future and that of his country will be precarious. So does the king, I mean, it sounds like the king knows this. But does he believe that his reign depends on an adversarial relationship with Israel?
I don't know if he thinks that it depends on it. I think he believes, and I think this is the theory that is being tested right now, that Israel's not going to do anything to upset this relationship. So it can, so that Jordan can continue to excoriate Israel at every turn, and that Israel's going to absorb it. And I don't know how sustainable that is. If the goal is to create a warm relationship along the lines of what we see with Bahrain or UAE or Morocco, then it's trending in the wrong direction. And of course, Jordan has refused to join the Negev Summit, which is a structure that operates in support of the Abraham Accords and includes Egypt and includes the United States. The Jordanians have been notably absent. In fact, they even didn't attend the signing ceremony of the Abraham Accords themselves in 2020. Not a really nice sign here. So I think that, again, the rhetoric to me, seems unsustainable and would put Israel and Jordan on the wrong path. It's the wrong message to send, by the way, to the king's subjects. The king can essentially call the tune when it comes to the contract between himself and his own subjects. And if he says that peace with Israel is important to Jordan and we have to invest in it, well, then the subjects of the Hashemite kingdom don't really have much of a say in the matter. But to your point and to Cliff's point, the dangers are growing. And there are several to point out here. One is, of course, the ISIS problem and the al-Qaeda problem. This is not new for Jordan, but it has been on Jordan's doorstep in places like Syria and Iraq for the last 10 years. There have been threats that we have already mentioned coming from the Arab Spring. And then on top of that, you've got the Iranian threat. The Iranians would love to break up that Sunni pragmatic pro-American crescent, as we just described it, not supporting that or eroding that is very much in Iran's interest. And actually, to that point, the Iranians have stood up, as we know, a bunch of Shiite militias. They're called Hashd al-Shabi, or popular mobilization units, and they're running around places like Syria and Iraq. And one of the things that I got a clearer picture on during my visit to Jordan in the fall was that at least some of them are working to destabilize Jordan through the drug trade. They're shipping massive amounts of a drug called Captagon. It's very popular in the Arabian Gulf and the Persian Gulf. And there was a time where Jordan was only the pass-through, right, where it was smuggled through Jordan en route to places like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, where they would fetch something like $20 a pill. What we're now hearing is that there's been a strategic decision made to try to sell these in Jordan itself at a lower price. It's something like $5 per pill. So what does that say? It says that Iran is looking to erode Jordan from within, through the drug trade, through this kind of social erosion. And so I think between all of this, and by the way, the Iranian threat is not just on the northern border, it's not just from Syria, it's not just from Iraq. We've also been hearing, the king actually mentioned this in a conversation with H.R. McMaster earlier this year, that there's concerns about Iranian naval activity in the Red Sea to the south of Jordan. And so there's, I'd say, a lot of concerns. Israel can do a lot to help on these fronts. Of course, Israel is one of the only active fighters against Iran in what we commonly describe as the war between wars, or the campaign between wars, where Israel is taking out Iranian assets in Syria just about every night. It's targeting Iranian naval vessels in the Red Sea, in the Mediterranean, in the Persian Gulf. And so in this way, Jordan really does need Israel. And I think the king, I don't know, maybe is taking that for granted, or is just willfully ignoring this in an attempt to rally support from his own people. It's really hard to understand his motivations here, especially as we see the region moving in a very different direction.
So you had brought up the Negev Summit. So I'm going to turn to Jordan's relationship with the Gulf nations. And is there any possible role that perhaps the UAE could play in moderating a warming of relations between Jordan and Israel? I mean, Jordan's I guess, failure to attend when the UAE, Bahrain, Egypt, and Morocco did attend the negative summit is an example of that strained relationship with Israel. But how does that play into the Gulf nations? You wrote in your report, I'm going to quote you, Jordan should not be counted among the Iranian axis that actively cause for Israel's destruction. That would be Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. However, Jordan today does not fit within the block of pragmatic states such as UAE, Bahrain, Egypt, and even Saudi Arabia. Instead, it appears to have found its place among the non-aligned states of the Arab world, for example, Algeria and Kuwait. These are states that advocate stridently for the Palestinian cause and reject normalization. But there is one difference between Jordan and the other states that fit this description. The others do not urgently require sustained assistance from America, Israel, and the Gulf states. This should give the Hashemite kingdom pause. And now you've touched on a lot of this, and I was going to ask you to elaborate on your quote. But what about, again, Jordan having relationships with these Arab nations that could help perhaps normalize things again with Israel and bring back a warm peace as opposed to this cold peace that we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, look, the important thing to remember here is that the UAE, not so much Bahrain, but the UAE and Saudi Arabia are crucial partners for Jordan, right? I mean, Jordan needs them for energy, but it also needs them for cash injections because the Jordanians are running debts that exceed GDP, right? I mean, this is a country that has been in tough shape. It was in tough shape before COVID. It was hit just like everybody else was during the COVID crisis. Things are a little bit better now, but they're certainly not out of the woods. I think the challenges continue. So for a country that needs to deepen these alliances with the UAE and with the Saudis, who are, as I think we all know, drawing closer to Israel quietly, but still drawing closer nonetheless. And their rhetoric, by the way, it's interesting. The Saudi rhetoric is gentler vis-a-vis Israel than Jordan's. Right. And Jordan is the one that has peace, and Saudi is the one that is not willing to go there yet. And so I think that there is a role. I think that both countries, I mean, I think the Saudis can, I think, probably show the Jordanians how you can be critical of Israel and try to push Israel in the right direction without screaming at them on the world stage. I think that is an important message for the Saudis to convey. And then for the Emiratis, you know, this is a country that has, you know, yesterday was maybe a tough day where Bibi was forced to postpone a visit because of the Ben Gvir Temple Mount walk. But by all accounts, things are going well with the UAE. And the UAE, I think, has a vested interest in trying to pull the Jordanians into this warmer structure, this new vision for the Middle East, one in which prosperity and stability. These are the two words that I've heard all over the Gulf for the last 4 or 5 years, that this is the focus right now of those that are trying to promote change in the region. It's prosperity and stability. Jordan seems to be working against that in some way when it goes out deliberately and hammers Israel during Ramadan every year, or it sides with Hamas during one of these recent flare-ups that we've seen most recently in 2021. It's just simply not helpful. So my hope anyway is that some of these Gulf states, and perhaps, again, the Saudis could play a role here, Morocco could play a role, even Egypt could play a role. I mean, that peace has gotten a bit warmer in recent years. And as we try to envision and try to advocate for a region in which cooperation and stability and prosperity, that these things will override all else. The hope is that we can tamp down on some of Jordan's ideological leanings and that Palestinian nationalist strain that they are trying to harness.
Thanks, John. But I want to know, as you talk about stability, what role has Obama's decision to abrogate the Pax Americana that maintained stability in the region for decades played in the deterioration of Israeli-Jordanian relations, if any? The void left has resulted in Russia, China, and Iran all exerting influence across the region. You know, we know Russia is now preoccupied in Ukraine, but it remains integrally involved in the region. Iran and its proxies are everywhere, from Yemen to Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria, as you pointed out earlier. And China's developing economic relationships across the region, including with Israel and the Saudis. So where is Jordan in all of this? And what does this mean from the US perspective as we watch our global adversaries increase their presence and influence in the Middle East?
It's fascinating. It's a great question. And look, I think the Jordanians are still all in on the United States, right? I mean, the Jordanians just signed a 7-year MOU, billions of dollars are now guaranteed from the US. And that's a sign to the Chinese that they're not, they're not going there with the Chinese, nor are they going there with the Russians, right? So they've already made their bed. And obviously the US and Israel enjoy a very strong relationship. It's one that, continues to grow and deepen, and here they are kind of bucking that trend, and they don't have an alternative, right? And in the meantime, you've got the Israelis. When you sort of think about militarily, as the United States looks to exit the region, it's the Israelis that are filling the void, right? It's the Israelis that are every night targeting Iran, and that they're really the only country in the region capable of going toe-to-toe with the Iranians. It's the Israelis that can help them train. It's the Israelis that can help them be stronger on the border or elsewhere. Certainly, the U.S. is still invested, but the longevity of that investment is now what's really in doubt. So it really, I would say there's some dissonance, and I think you're right to point it out. There's some dissonance here, that they're all in with the United States, but the United States is leaving, and Israel is really the only other game in town. And here they are rejecting Israel on a regular basis, making it harder for the Israelis to work with them. Now, that said, I mean, there are still military exercises that are ongoing. I don't want to give the sense that the Jordanians have rejected all cooperation. I mean, they just signed a couple of agreements, one to refurbish the Jordan River. There was a blue flag exercise, a red flag exercise, important military exercises, and the intelligence cooperation and everything else is ongoing. But as all these things are happening, this idea of slamming Israel at every opportunity, and doing so at the UN, doing so in their media, doing so in our media, is something that just something's wrong. Something is off. And again, that was the main reason for me to put pen to paper on this most recent report.
So I have there's a lot of questions in the queue, but I have 2 more questions for you, and I want to stick with the US for just a minute. Is there a role that the US can play in mediating the tensions that have arisen? I mean, does the Biden administration get what's going on? Does it have the wherewithal to get involved in ways that you suggest in your report? I mean, the administration refused to even use the term Abraham Accords when it first came into office, and it's certainly developed a very adversarial relationship with the Saudis when it came into office, although I think it's waking up to the needs to have the Saudis as an ally for energy purposes. But it just doesn't seem to be making policy decisions consistent with the needs of the region or our ultimate national security. So given the U.S.'s strong trade relationship with Jordan, as you pointed out, and the fact that we are the Jordan's largest supplier of aid, shouldn't we be able to wield some influence over their policy? I mean, we do that with Israel.
Yeah, we should be. And, I mean, I think it certainly would make sense for the State Department and by the way, also the Pentagon to go to the Jordanians and say, hey, cut it out. You got a problem with the Israelis on what's happening on the Temple Mount or during Ramadan. Talk to them quietly. This idea of coming out publicly and trashing a peace partner. I mean, some of the allegations have been outrageous that Israel is, purging Christians from the country. And of course, we know that is wildly inaccurate. That Christians enjoy freedom of religion and probably more so than any other country in the region. And here you have the king getting up at the UN just last year and excoriating Israel over that. Things like that, you would think that the US could come in and say, guys, go to your corners, right? Everybody take a deep breath. That's certainly what I would recommend here. The Pentagon, I think, has maybe even more sway than the State Department in that sense, because it's the military assistance, it's the basing, it's the training and everything else. The problem, I think, has been, and I do mention this in the report as well, is that Jordan is generally identified as a country that's too weak to fail. That we just need to keep giving it more because of how weak it is financially, politically, demographically. So we can't go there, right? But at the end of the day, I believe that if we want Jordan to be stronger, we need to be able to criticize it. We need to be able to push it in a more sustainable direction, because right now, again, I think this has been unsustainable. So I think there is a role for the US to play. I think there's a role for President Biden to play. I think there's a role for the new Congress to play here. Just even a sense of Congress, something that really lets the Jordanians know that this is not okay, that it's time to dial it back. All these things are important. Now, there are things that, by the way, that Israel will do that are probably worthy of criticism. Again, I think more quiet criticism here is a better way than, for example, during the 2021 war, it really did seem as if Jordan was siding with Hamas. That's just not helpful. And when we think about, we talked about Jordan's traditional role of being a bulwark against radicalism in the region. They've gone in the opposite direction here, right? Their rhetoric sounds more like Hamas, more like Iran, and those are things that I think we need to really curb. So, of course, look, these are countries, they're sovereign, they can do what they want, they can say what they want. But when the United States is looking to manage those relationships, it is upon us to weigh in and to let them know where we think the boundaries are. And I do believe that if we do weigh in, Jordan will respect it.
So I want to turn, you touched on the new Israeli government earlier. And, I think that putting aside Ben-Gvir's recent trip to the Temple Mount, which I think was overblown in my view. I mean, are the red lines that King Abdullah has drawn, which are, the annexation and control over the Temple Mount, is this saber rattling for his population? Or do you think that, do you really think the new Israeli government is going to pursue aggressive policies that are being warned about, and not really even just from King Abdullah? I mean, from the United States, we've got senators, we've got congresspeople, and we've got Jake Sullivan now heading to Israel to address these concerns as well. So, what can you just elaborate a little bit more on the tensions between the two nations, and whether it's a personality conflict between Bibi and Abdullah, or what exactly are we seeing play out with this new government?
Look, it's a personality conflict without question. I mentioned already that Bibi and the king did not get along, and from all reports that we've got from Israel, and they were confirmed to some extent by the Jordanians, that things were not great. Their personalities didn't mesh, and that happens. It doesn't mean that you need to scrap the peace agreement from 1994 because the personalities don't mesh. You find other people to work together, and they work together. And I think the bureaucracies, by the way, continue to work together between Jordan and Israel, and things on the things that matter the most, things are going fine. At the political level, I would say, there is concern. I would note that, the statements made by Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, and perhaps even others, probably are cause for concern for the Jordanians. They don't want to see the status quo changed on the Temple Mount. They don't want to see annexation of the West Bank. Okay, those are fair things to say. I don't know if you need to scream about them before a government even takes its place in the Knesset, right? I mean, these were things that the king was talking about before the government was formed. Now we're 2 days into a government, and the rhetoric is already at something of a fever pitch. I think that's problematic. I think there's no reason to be yelling about this. I think the conversations need to take place among, those who are level-headed and who are looking to preserve the relationship. And so my hope anyway is that that's where things go. But the thing that I just want to point out here, when we talk about the rhetoric of the Israeli, the new Israeli leadership, and where Israeli policy could go, it's important to remember that in 2020, the Abraham Accords, right, the peace agreement between the UAE and Israel, came about right as Israel was considering annexation of parts of the West Bank. And what the UAE did, and this is the model, right, where they said, look, you can't do that, but we're not just going to tell you that you can't do it, we're going to give you an alternative, a better alternative. We're going to offer you peace. And you need to put off this annexation bid that you're considering right now. And we're going to make peace with you. And man, this is going to help you a lot more, Bibi, than anything else that you think you might be able to get out of annexation. And so I think Jordan needs to be thinking about carrot, not stick, as we like to say in Washington. There need to be inducements here to not do the things that he's concerned about. But the problem is that, again, it's just, I think the king is speaking to it's a populist message. It's the wrong message in my view. I mean, when I was in Jordan, I saw some things that really troubled me. I mean, bumper stickers on some of the cars were bumper stickers of Saddam Hussein. Okay. Saddam Hussein is actually experiencing some kind of a resurgence in popularity in death that he may not have even had in life, right? He is now seen as these, intransigent strongman who refused to bow to the desires of the United States, refused to compromise on things like Israel. And so now he's being celebrated. And you see this more and more on the streets of Amman and beyond. There were placards of saying no to gas from the occupation. So in other words, Jordanians in some cases would rather freeze, not be able to put food on their table, not be able to cook for their families, than to take gas from Israel. And I get the sense anyway that the king is sort of tapping in to some of these sentiments. And I think so, rather than coming up with policies that provide alternatives for the Israelis, that sway them away from some of their, let's say, the temptations that would not portend well for stability in the region, it looks like the Jordanians are stoking things further with some of the rhetoric coming out of the king, the royal court, and some of his senior officials.
Okay, great. I'm glad you brought up the bumper stickers. That was my final question before turning to the Q&A, so you beat me to it. So I'm going to turn to the questions now, and a couple of people have asked about the Palestinian terrorist Ahlam Tamimi, who was the mastermind behind the Sbarro pizza bombing. She was released in the trade for Gilad Shalit, and she had been in jail. Now she's a free, I think, TV star in Jordan, and there have been numerous requests that she be extradited to the United States to stand trial, since there were Americans that were killed in the Sbarro pizza bombing. So people are asking your thoughts on, is there any will to put pressure on Abdullah to make them comply? There is an extradition treaty between the US and Jordan. And what is your opinion on this? Could extraditing her actually cause the king to come closer to being toppled?
I don't know if it would cause him to be toppled. I don't know if she's such a cause celeb in Jordan that it would matter. I do think it's really harmful and rather disgusting even to see her with that kind of popularity in Jordan. It's shameful that Jordan would allow this to continue. The idea of extraditing her, though, from what I understand, and I'm not a lawyer and I'm not saying that I endorse this view, but from what I've heard, because she's already served time and because Israel already agreed to her release from jail in that prisoner exchange, the idea of sending her back to stand trial elsewhere is complicated significantly. This is what I understand. But the fact that maybe she, it might be difficult for her to stand trial twice, or to serve two different sentences for the same crime, there is this question of why give her that platform? Why allow her that platform? And for those that would say, well, it's a free country, it's actually not in Jordan, right? I mean, this is a country where media is heavily censored, where people do have to watch what they say. It's not Iran, it's not, North Korea, but this is a place where messages are censored by the government. So the government does have within its power to tamp down on the sort of footprint that she has, that public footprint that she has. So I would say that the government should be doing at least that. And, for me, I think there's a question from the State Department now. It would be good to get clarification from state about whether or not we even could extradite her because of that double jeopardy issue that I've heard explained to me on numerous occasions.
Thank you. Is Qatar influential in Jordan? Qatar seems to be the most hardline Hamas-friendly place in the region.
I think it's influential, but I wouldn't say that it's more influential there than anywhere else. What's interesting, of course, is that Khalid Meshal and a number of other Hamas figures had made Jordan their home until Israel actually tried to assassinate Khalid Meshal, and then shortly thereafter, the Jordanian office was vacated. From there, they moved to Syria, and then from there, they moved to Qatar and Turkey, in fact. What's really interesting now, amidst all the rhetoric and all the sort of nasty stuff that we're seeing out of Jordan, there were stories that Khalid Meshal was spending more time in Jordan again, that his family is based there, and that they were, I guess, talking to him more. The Jordanian officials were talking to him more, and perhaps trying to get a sense of whether, there was a longer term arrangement that could be made. I've not heard any updates on this since. I think that it would be highly problematic for Jordan to welcome the Hamas leadership once again on Israel's borders. From what I understand, the Turks, because of rapprochement with Israel, they're considering other options for some of the Hamas figures that are based there. Qatar has, I think, drawn down a little bit. So there is a question now, an open question of where Hamas can establish its foothold. Let's hope that Jordan is not that place.
Someone asked why Jordan is never confronted on its horrific human rights record regarding Jews and Jewish holy places during the time they controlled the territories and places at issue today. And I would just take that a step further, Jonathan, and ask you to maybe also touch on what it means in the 94 deal that Jordan was assigned the role of custodian of the religious authorities on the Temple Mount versus Israel's sovereignty over.
Yeah. I mean, look, Jordan expunged all Jews, right? Expelled them, right? It was Judenrein in the West Bank. There were war crimes during the 1948-49 war. Some of the fiercest fighting during that war took place in the West Bank and in Jerusalem. Of course, it was vicious fighting on both sides. I don't know if I would want to single out Jordan for anything beyond what we've already sort of baked into our understanding of that war of independence for Israel, or the Nakba, as the Palestinians would call it. But I would say that, Jordan did as much to expel Jews, if not more, than, what they are complaining about now in terms of Israeli policies. I mean, Israel has a policy where, Arabs are allowed, as long as they're living peacefully within Jerusalem, they can stay, and in the West Bank, right, unless, we're talking about families of terrorists and things like that, they stay in their homes. So Israel, perhaps you could say, has behaved better in recent years than Jordan did during that time of conflict. That role of the custodian is an interesting one. It's written into the peace agreement of 1994. I know that Jordan takes it seriously, and part of their problem is that they don't have the personnel, the guards. They're not always given the approval to bring more people into the Temple Mount compound. Israel's not always giving them the approvals that they need. That's part of the tension. Also, when Israel is they put in metal detectors and cameras. This is, as far as Jordan is concerned, it's a change of the status quo. Okay, I understand that Jordan wants to keep things as they are, but there's, I think, two things that are often ignored. One is that this is still sovereign Israeli soil, so Israel does have the right to do things on its own soil, in its own country, and also that this is also a Jewish holy site. And look, I think the way in which Ben Gvir, or even Ariel Sharon in 2000, when he walked up on the Temple Mount, one got a sense then, and as they did yesterday, that it was a deliberate attempt to provoke. And I don't necessarily think that that's a wise thing to do. But on the other hand, Israel does have, and Israeli citizens have, a right to see the Temple Mount. They have a right to go up on it. There are rules that have been established as to when Jews can and can't go up. I think Israel is bent over backwards to accommodate the Jordanians and the Palestinians and to make sure that they don't stir up trouble within the Arab world. I think more can be done, but I also think there needs to be some flexibility. There may even need to be some rewriting of rules between Jordan and Israel. And that may be something, I mean, I do talk about this at the end of my report, that perhaps it's time to just go back and revisit some of this and to think about ways to relieve some of the tensions and to work through solutions, whether it's the United States, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's UAE. There needs to be, I think, a better understanding of what Israel can and can't do on its own soil.
Are private communications going on that are different than the public communications?
For sure. For sure. I mean, look, the military to military ties are excellent. The intelligence ties between the GID, the Mukhabarat, and the Mossad are excellent. The MFA, Ministry of Foreign Affairs connections to Jordan's foreign ministry are good. They're maybe not always great. They're good. The problem again is it's the public rhetoric, but also I think there's an underlying sense that Jordan is still, some of the meetings that I took while I was in Jordan, I got the sense like that it's as if I was visiting Jordan as I did in like 1995, 1998. As if it was still soon after the peace agreement, that they still hadn't quite come to terms with the fact that this is not a combatant, not an enemy anymore. There is a distrust that the Jordanians still hold to the Israelis that I just don't see on the other side, right? On the Israeli side, it's just like, look, we want to make peace with everybody. They may not like all of our policies, but we're ready to make peace with them. We don't hate anybody here. We just want prosperity for the region. And, I think the Jordanians will say, well, look at your policies. You don't want peace. And I think the Israelis would probably say in response, what you're angry about are things that we're either doing on sovereign soil or in disputed territories, and that should not be your concern. And this kind of gets back to the kind of key question of the Abraham Accords themselves. And, the title was neither here nor there, that Jordan hasn't picked a side in all of this. What the Jordanians aren't doing is what the other Abraham Accords partners have done, which is they've said, look, we care about the Palestinians, but we're not going to let it dominate our national agenda. We're not going to allow this to become a core national interest any longer. We're going to think about our own things, technology and trade and defense and things like that. And Israel's going to be important for that. Jordan has not done that yet. They've not made that decision. And that is why I think they continue to harp on these Israeli decisions that are being taken in Jerusalem and the West Bank and perhaps even Gaza as well.
Thanks, John. We have some people asking why Israel doesn't threaten to cut off some of the other items that it provides, for instance, water. And someone also asked, how much water does Israel actually provide to Jordan, and how dependent is Jordan on that? Isn't that, couldn't these things be used to influence policy? Yeah,
I don't have the exact, square, whatever it is, square meter of water or gallons. I do know that there's a certain amount prescribed in the 1994 peace agreement. I do know that that the Israelis have given more. If you noted, there was a piece, I think it was either in the Washington Post or the New York Times just a few weeks ago, looking at the shortage of water in Jordan and how things, the resources are running out. So there is really no reason at this point for Israel to be cutting any of this off. It could threaten to do it, but I don't think that's what's helpful here. I think maintaining the status quo, having Israel uphold its end of the bargain, having Jordan uphold its end of the bargain. The key here is just more of, getting both sides to understand that they need each other, and that, public spats should be private. Disagreements can be ironed out quietly behind closed doors. I think that's been where I'm most concerned. I think the more public these things are, the more chance there is of a full rupture. right? Where you have an open diplomatic spat, as opposed to just Israel absorbing a lot of this rather nasty rhetoric.
So a couple people have asked some questions relating to the stability, I guess, of the Jordanian regime. What's the likelihood of the regime being overthrown, similar to what happened in Iran in '79, or just having it fall? And what, if that were to happen, what would follow?
Look, the unrest in the streets continues sporadically and not in huge number. The king regularly sacks the cabinet and rebuilds. It's sort of window dressing, but it suffices for now. I don't think that there's some sort of imminent threat to Jordan. I do know that, of course, there's Muslim Brotherhood and there's Islamists and there's, democracy advocates and people that are opposed to the policies of the regime. But as you may have noted, during the Arab Spring, the monarchies stayed intact, right? It was the republics that often were the ones that were hit. And I think that's holding, at least from what I can tell. It's a really interesting phenomenon that the Arab world loves its kings, it loves its royal families. That's no indication of the future, but certainly that's what we've identified up until now. But I do think that the king does have some serious choices to make, some serious decisions as it relates to the Palestinian population, what the contract is with his people as it relates to Israel. It has to also think about, its relationship with the Gulf Arab states, the ones that are providing the energy resources, the ones that are providing those, hard cash injections. Jordan, I think, needs to draw closer. I think it has a good relationship with the UAE. With the Saudis, it's a little less stable. It's a little bit more shaky. I understand that the relationship between the king and MBS is not perfect. It's not terrible, but it's not perfect either. At one point during a purported coup attempt, it was not a serious one. It was more of a family squabble that King Abdullah blamed the Saudis for some of what was going on, some of the drama that was happening within his family. I think that ended up being proven not true, but the fact that that was even an issue, I think, is worth watching. Because I do think that the Saudis have an important role to play here, not just with Israel, but with the overall stability of the region, and certainly the stability of Jordan.
Is there a designated future king of Jordan?
Yeah, the king's son, who actually just got engaged when I was there. This was in September. He got engaged to a Saudi woman. Perhaps maybe as an indication of where foreign policy needs to go or will go. But yeah, we see the same. We see pictures now, much as we saw of Abdullah when he was younger, next to his father. Those photos. Now there's photos of his son as well. So there is a clear line of succession. Whether the son is, from what I understand, his Arabic's better than his father, but maybe is a little less invested in the tribes and things like that. But I think this just may be a sign of modernity. We'll have to just wait and see how all that plays out. But, the hope, of course, is that King Abdullah has a long reign, maintains stability in the region, and figures out how to just right the ship as it relates to ties between Israel and the Hashemite kingdom.
Well, I think on that note, that's a great way to end. And I can't thank you enough for joining us today, Jonathan. As always, you are brilliant and your work is so critically important. I love that you traveled to Saudi Arabia, you traveled to Jordan. You can't get this information and you can't provide these insights if you're not there. Your wealth of knowledge is always greatly appreciated. Our audience appreciates it as well. I appreciate our audience for joining us today. And again, this is recorded, and please share far and wide. I think it was a very important webinar. So I wish everybody a good afternoon. And again, Jonathan, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.